welcome to the Modern German Identity podcast. You are listening to Part 2, The European Economy and the European Union. Today's guest is Dr. Ognian Hishaw, a professor of European economics at the Freie Universität Berlin.
The German economy went through a resounding recovery following World War II and reshaped the identity of Germany and its place in Europe. This podcast will look at the changes in economic development following post-war Europe. There was a huge difference in post-war economic policies of both West and East. Economic development also allowed for the younger generation to experience a change in culture during the economic miracle. The establishment of the European Economic Community and its evolution into the modern European Union drastically shifted how European countries interacted with each other. All in all, the goal is to understand how these economic developments within Europe helped to shape the identities of German citizens in the post-war period. Economic developments would shift German identity towards being an essential part of Europe rather than a separate and dominating force within it. The post-war years of the Federal Republic were marked with what is known as Wirtschaftswunder, or the economic miracle. By the 1960s, economic growth rates in Western Europe had soared, mostly as a result of the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan brought forth an influx of capital from American investors to help rebuild the markets of Europe. This, in turn, would build a stronger economy in the Western nations and help compete with the Soviet bloc that was being established in the East. This influx of cash, as well as the listing of market restrictions in the 1950s, sparked a lasting period of economic prosperity in both West Germany and Europe. This economic power would also influence and help economic integration programs such as the European Economic Community years later. Although the economic establishment of West Germany happened fairly quickly in the economic boom of the 50s and 60s, Germans still had other problems. West Germany after World War II was in a bit of an identity crisis. People did not know what it meant to be German. The Prussian Empire had led a massive defeat in World War I and was left in economic ruin. The Nazi era's propaganda and the Holocaust had disgraced the nation as well. The period from 1945 to 1965 saw a redefinition of what it meant to be German, which came out of the economic boom and influx of Western economic power. The idea of Americanization provided pop culture to the ordinary people of West Germany. This shifted the social dynamic away from the aristocracy, which had controlled culture in the past with German high class. This emergence of a lower-class mainstream culture shifted the ideas of common Germans towards trends in line with democracy, free market economy, and the mass production of consumer goods. Americanized pop culture was also a way for Germans to move past both Prussian high-class culture as well as their Nazi past, and move forward to creating a new idea of westernized German culture. Beginning in 1956, conflicts arose between this new German culture and the older generations. Kids began playing rock and roll instead of Beethoven, wearing jeans instead of clean-cut trousers, and reading comics instead of Goethe. By the 1970s, 80% of West German households had a television set. These changes were a way for the younger generation of Germany to push back against the egregious past of their ancestors and develop a new identity. The past ideals of Germans in relation to culture was that of Sonderbewusstsein. This is the idea that German culture was superior to Western culture. These examples from the generation from 1945 to 1965 demonstrate the radical departure from this previous German image. Instead of German superiority over Western culture, the new generations of Germans were able to accept their own unique role within Western culture, creating an almost full departure from Sonderbewusstsein, or the idea of German cultural supremacy. In 1968, the Vergangenheitsbewältigung movement, or the Coming to Terms with the Past movement, sprung up from the same generation of Americanized Germans in order to end the silence from the older generation in relation to the Holocaust. This Western culture integration marked the beginning of several unique events that would shape the foundations of this new German identity. Flashing back to the immediate post war, East Germany was put on a whole different economic trajectory due to its association with the Soviet Union. In the early post war years, the Soviets fought to maintain as direct control of East Germany as possible because of its strong economic potential. By doing so, the Soviets developed a sphere of influence that stretched from their borders along the neighboring states up until East Germany. These included, most notably, Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary. This influence over the region, established in the immediate post-war period, would be the foundation of the Soviet bloc economy that would influence economic policy in Eastern Europe until the 1990s. The Soviet Union's economy was based on a state-run communist system where the state controlled the factors of production. They determined what was produced and how much was produced. They also controlled access to goods for consumers. This economic structure was fundamentally different from the West, which relied on the free market to make decisions for product supply and demand. The communist economic system had many limitations to it, but the largest one was its need for natural resources. In order for the state to produce at unnaturally high rates, it relied on large amounts of natural resources. This is where satellite countries came in. The Soviets developed a system in which the countries of the Soviet bloc, East Germany, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria, would produce natural resources that could then be shipped back to the Soviet Union for the production of goods. This system essentially created a Soviet Union that became reliant on an unequal balance of trade, where natural resources were being imported into the country.
Was a completely different type of economy. The Western economy was a market-based one, and the Soviet bloc economy was a command economy, where a central planning of all activities took place in order to mobilize resources in favor of some sectors, while leaving behind other sectors, and their economy was totally out of balance all over the decades after the war. And that's why they lost the economic competition with the West. And while the Western example was shining and gleaming bright, the situation in the Soviet bloc, became more and more gloomy and dark and gray and unattractive, and that's why finally they collapsed and and decided to change course after that collapse. And now there is no centrally planned economy anywhere anymore in the eastern part of Europe.
Because the Soviets had all of the power, they often controlled where resources fell in the bloc, and for the most part, these resources were imported solely into the Soviet Union, leaving the bloc countries struggling. One source said, "In East Berlin, a good part of the destruction still remained. Twisted iron, broken walls, and heaped up rubble were common enough sights. The new structures, especially the prefabricated workers' tenements, looked drab. Automobiles, generally old, and small cars were in much smaller numbers than in West Berlin. Shops in East Berlin exhibited cheap articles in indifferent wrappers or containers, and the prices for these comparable items, despite the poor quality, were noticeably higher than in West Berlin. Visiting East Berlin gave the impression of visiting a prison camp." The reason that the West became so much more successful was because they put money back into the European economies instead of just pulling resources out. This allowed for Western European countries to bounce back and become powerful and equal trade partners for countries like the US and Great Britain. Free market incentives also allowed for Western economies to operate faster and more efficiently than in the East. Because the Eastern Bloc countries were not given this opportunity, their economies were not able to fully recover and therefore relied on the status of the Soviet machine. They needed the Soviets to put goods back into the system after they were produced. In turn, the Soviet bloc countries, like East Germany, fell behind the economic conditions of the West because they were never independently established. Instead of bouncing back and establishing independent trade deals that benefited them, these countries relied on the basically forced exportation of natural resources to the Soviet Union, which put tremendous strain on their economies and heavy reliance on the Soviets for economic services.
I grew up on the wrong side of the Iron Curtain, and here, especially here in Berlin, in this great city, and at the same time weird city, we knew just a couple of yards further west, there was a completely different world, completely different from our world. But for us, that other world, which we were longing for, getting in touch with, was out of reach because of the wall and because of the border. And the border was a terrible one. It was an absolutely deadly one, and everyone knew, even getting closer to this border or to this wall was a sort of a personal hazard. But still, we knew the wall is separating us from them, and also we were aware of the fact that their fate has been much more benevolent to them than our fate to us, because we suffered all those shortages, in the broadest sense. Personal opinion, expression of personal opinion was prohibited. Getting information by free media was impossible and was even persecuted. And on top of this came, material suffering. We were, looking for things that were self-explicable in the West, but totally out of reach in our world. You may laugh now, but we were longing for bananas. Bananas were a sort of a luxury good, and many other such things. And that's why, the generation, the post-war generation in the eastern part of Europe was very much, impacted and shaped by the fact that there is a border and a wall between the two worlds and two political systems.
Starting in the early post-war period, many Europeans held the idea that they wanted to do anything possible to avoid another devastating war. Historically, the main battlefront of European wars had been fought between rivals Germany and France, and there needed to be a better way to prevent this. In 1950, France and Germany established economic reconciliation. This combined their coal and steel industries. Coal and steel are the major components of making war, so by sharing these resources openly, they could no longer stockpile them to fight each other. This idea would be the start of a long period of European economic integration that would eventually result in the EU. After the success of the combination of French and German coal and steel industries in the 1950s, several other European nations jumped on board. In 1951, 6 countries, France, the Federal Republic of Germany, Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, and Italy, signed a treaty establishing the European Coal and Steel Community, which integrated the industries amongst all of these countries. This was successful, and several years later there was a call to fully integrate the economies of these countries. In 1957, the Treaty of Rome created the European Economic Community, whose main goal was to establish a common market including free movement of capital and labor between member states. The community was also eliminating tariffs between member states and established common policies on transport, trade, and agriculture. This integration would make the free market developments more efficient amongst member states by allowing resources and labor to flow without tariffs. The development of the European Economic Community, as well as the influx of cash from the Marshall Plan, would all help to contribute to the economic miracle that was outlined earlier from the 1950s to the 1960s.
A famous and brilliant French politician, Jean Monnet, was even, suggesting to set up the United States of Europe. So the vision was we are leaving behind the separation and we are moving towards a broader unity, the United States of Europe. This finally didn't happen, but still the groundwork was laid for a process of integration, and in the longer run, getting closer and closer together. At that time, a political unity was a bit out of reach, shortly after the war and after those, terrible experience of the past. But at least one avenue towards unity was promising, and that was a economic cooperation. That's why they started with the European Economic Communities, with the further idea to broaden that someday, at some point later, towards a political unity. And now we are on our way exactly there.
Slowly, the European Economic Community grew more popular amongst political elites, and a government body was needed to establish a common set of European laws in their integrated market. In 1965, the Merger Treaty sought to establish a basic form of government for this new European system. A commission, composed of commissioners chosen by the heads of states, proposed European laws. A council, made up of ministers of the member states, approved laws and regulations passed by the Commission. The Parliament, made up of representatives of the people of Europe, modified those laws. There was also a court of justice system that ruled over the legality of decisions. One of the major policies to come out of the European Economic Community in the 1960s was the Common Agricultural Policy. This was a policy of the European Economic Community to provide centralized subsidized funding to poorer agricultural regions and help the European agricultural industry. This policy remains as one of the main and central policies of the European Union today. In the 1970s, Ireland, the United Kingdom, and Denmark all joined the community, making it much more widespread in Europe and drastically increasing its market size. The oil crisis of 1973 was a turning point in Europe's post-war economic history. It slowed down economic confidence and brought about Western Europe's first post-war recession. Between 1950 and 1973, the annual economic growth rates had been 4.7% in both Western and Eastern Europe. In the 20 years following the oil crisis, growth rates were more than halved. This economic recession was the first major test of European economic stability. Unemployment in Europe leapt from an average of 2 to 4% from 1950 to 1973 to more than 12% in the later decade. The worst hit sectors were labor-intensive industries like mining, steel, shipbuilding, and textiles. Western Germany was one of the most successful European countries with coping with this recession. Inflation was held under 5% between 1973 and 1981, and unemployment was below 3%. This is partially due to the European Economic Community, which, along with U.S. support, helped the country through these poor economic conditions brought upon by the oil crisis. Eastern Bloc countries, on the other hand, had their debts skyrocket in the 1970s because of the oil crisis. East Germany's debt had risen 40 times in the 1970s. The Soviet bloc faced more serious difficulties in dealing with the recession than the West did. Their state-run economies were inefficient, uncompetitive, and technologically dated compared to that of Western countries. They could not be changed or altered without changing the political systems that controlled them. This meant that any quick change could completely derail the Soviet bloc economy. While Western Germany had international support from the rest of Western Europe and the United States to help them adapt to global conditions, the East German state was inflexible and relied on the Soviet Union, which had also failed to adapt to the quick-changing conditions of the world market. The economic crisis of the 1970s showed not only a great difference in the economic structures in dealing with a crisis, but also provided an economic blow to East Germany that it would struggle to recover from until reunification.
Okay, I even remember it. I was a young man at that time, but that crisis was such a terrible shock. Um, well, unsurprisingly, we had a recession, even depression at that time. That was followed by the so-called situation of stagflation. So prices were going up, but by inflation, but at the same time the economy was stagnant. So this first oil price shock, is seared in the memories of many older Europeans, and not just Europeans, also Americans. So people, citizens in the Western world. Well, this was the short-term effect, and then slowly, after a while, the economy started turning around, and then politicians and also economic policy makers learned something very important. They learned they have to allow the economy rely more on the market forces than that was the case before. In the early post-war years, especially less so in Germany, but more so in France and in Italy, so in the other important partners, a reliance on central planning, not quite Soviet style, but still some intervention by the state was, significant. And after this shock, they learned they have to leave the recovery more to the market forces, and the more they relied on that, the faster the economy recovered.
During the 1980s, more countries sought to join in on the success of the European Economic Community after the crisis. Spain, Portugal, and Greece all joined the community during the 1980s and were collectively known as Club Med for their location on the Mediterranean Sea. Also in the 1980s, Margaret Thatcher began to complain that the United Kingdom did not receive enough from the Common Agricultural Policy and argued for a reduction in their contributions. After negotiations with the community government, the United Kingdom was able to limit the amount of its contributions and increase the amount that it received as part of the Common Agricultural Policy. In 1987, the Single European Act pushed even harder for a single common market. This new act further eliminated trade barriers and allowed for even freer movement of people, goods, capital, and labor. After reunification in 1990, the new and reunified Germany joined the European Economic Community. This reunified Germany became a major player, contributing the most to the European Economic Community's central funding, as well as the most seats to the parliament, more than any other European country. In 1992, the Maastricht Treaty officially created the European Union. The treaty established a new and more official European state based off of the European Economic Community's original government, and it set the groundwork for a new and common European currency. In 1992, only a few things were missing from the EU, and people began working towards them. The first major idea was to establish the European Union as a region without any border controls. This would mean that French citizens or German citizens would all just be considered European Union citizens, and they could travel freely without any passports. The other push was for a centralized common currency that would be able to rival the United States dollar. Both of these ideas were radical, but they would come about in the turn of the millennium. In 1995, Austria, Sweden, and Finland joined the European Union, creating an even larger community. Under the Treaty of Amsterdam in 1997, the Schengen Agreement, which eliminated all border controls within the EU, was finally realized. Now all citizens of the European Union could move about freely without the need for passports or internal border restrictions. In 1999, the euro and the European Central Bank were established, realizing the other major goal. The euro did an online launch in 1999 and was launched physically in the year 2000. Some countries, however, opted out of the common currency, worrying that it would hurt their economic conditions by being monetarily integrated. The United Kingdom, Sweden, and Denmark did not want the currency and chose to opt out of it. The 2000s saw the biggest additions to the EU in its history. In 2004, 10 new countries joined the European Union. Most were previous Soviet bloc countries, including Poland, the Czech Republic, and Hungary, which joined after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. This raised the number of states in the EU to 25 different countries, encompassing almost the whole continent. In 2007, Romania and Bulgaria joined, and in 2013, Croatia joined as well, making it the final addition to the EU. 2020 has been marked with the recent departure of the United Kingdom from the European Union. It is still unknown what the full effects of this Brexit will be, but the departure of the United Kingdom has caused a substantial decrease in the European Union's population because the United Kingdom was the second largest member state prior to its departure.
Well, the original idea is still there of, deeper and broader integration, more cooperation, and, what is new now is they started off with 6 founding member states, 3 of them bigger by European standards, and 3 of them, the other 3 rather small. Now we, at the peak of this process of extension and growth of the European Union, we were 28, but then the British in 2016 decided to leave. Now we are still 27. You can compare the this progress from 6 to now 27. And we are now a European Union. They started as a European Economic Community, and now notice the difference. European Union signals more than just economic cooperation. Now it signals there is also a political integration, and the participating member states are moving closer together on many fronts. One front being the economy, but another front being the political integration. And this is the achievement which was anticipated and desired at the beginning, and now we are getting there.
Reunified Germany in the past 30 years has been re-established through a new European identity. In the words of German Chancellor Helmut Kohl, Die Pfalz ist meine Heimat, Deutschland ist mein Vaterland und Europa ist unsere Zukunft. This place is my home, Germany is my fatherland, but Europe is our future. Many Germans now share European pride as a way to embody their nationalism that is not reminiscent of their Nazi past. In fact, all German public state buildings are required to fly both the German flag alongside with the flag of the European Union. This shows that Germany is not above the rest of Europe, but instead a part of it. Germany, as the leading economic power on the continent, has paved the way for the EU to prosper economically and has provided a social and economic union that can rival that of the United States. Through these economic changes and developments since World War II, Germany has been able to redefine itself within the context of Europe and aims to push for a more peaceful and united European state.